very much for that introduction. That was a pretty big day when the healthcare decision came down, and it was completely wrong for the first 5 minutes, wasn't it? Am I on? Can y'all hear me? Okay. Thank you to the host and the organizing committee, and especially Rich Gordon, who has been a wonderful friend and colleague for many of the decades I'm going to talk about today, more than either one of us probably care to admit. He and many pioneers have really helped develop and grow what we call precision journalism, and we owe them our thanks. And I'm going to take you back a little bit in time and talk about the roots of what brought us here today. This is an event that changed the world and changed journalism forever. It came to be called the Long Hot Summer of 1967. Segregationist Lester Maddox was the governor of Georgia. Lyndon Johnson was president. Campus and public protests of the Vietnam War were emerging and growing. Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and Jimi Hendrix were all popular, though not with the same kids, I don't think. And newsrooms across America were overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly male. All those white male reporters were covering racial unrest that was growing by the day. By the time things got hot in Detroit, there had already been race riots in Tampa, Buffalo, Newark, and Minneapolis. There would ultimately be 159 race riots across America in 1967. Our focus is Detroit. In the early morning hours of July 23rd, police raided the Economy Printing Building on 12th Street. Their target was an unlicensed after-hours bar on the second floor in the office of the United Community League for Civic Action. They expected to find a small handful of partiers, and instead they surprised 82 African Americans who had gathered to welcome home 2 local veterans of Vietnam. The police decided to arrest everyone present, and that was a very bad decision. It took a while to get all the paddy wagons down, and by the time they got everybody organized to arrest, a sizable crowd had grown in the community around the area. Police were not trusted in black neighborhoods in Detroit, where citizens said they had been abused and harassed and were frequent targets of brutality. A doorman later took responsibility for starting the mayhem by stirring up the crowd and throwing a bottle at police. And that began the deadliest riot of the long hot summer of 1967. It lasted 5 days and killed 43 people, 23 civilians, 20 law enforcement or military. More than 2,000 buildings burned. The riot was the deadliest and one of the most destructive in U.S. history, not the deadliest, but one of the deadliest. 2 daily newspapers were big dogs in Detroit then, the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press, but they were out big dogged. National players like Time and Newsweek and the networks began arriving very quickly. The Detroit Free Press was owned by a night newspaper chain, and 2 days into the rioting, their staff was so exhausted that the editor called up the Night Washington Bureau for backup. And Phil Meyer answered the phone. He's the hero of our story today, a Kansas-born farm boy, Navy veteran, and recent graduate of the illustrious Nieman program at Harvard University. We'll get back to him in just a minute. In Detroit, entire blocks burned to the ground. Thousands were arrested. They had to set up temporary jails in places like public bathhouses and auditoriums. Relief agencies set up across the city to take donations for those who had been displaced by the violence. Police were overwhelmed, and initially the state police and sheriff's department were called in to help. That wasn't enough. The National Guard had to come in, and then 4,700 soldiers from the U.S. Army's 82nd and 101st Airborne. By late Wednesday night, Phil was in Detroit, riding along with the National Guard amid burning buildings and gunshots. By the next day, he was building what we in the news business call a Sunday takeout, a long narrative piece that would trace the chronology of the riots, interweaving official and participant reactions. After his story was edited on deadline Saturday, he joined the other journalists gathered in the city room to knock around ideas about what kind of follow-up stories they should do. This happens in every newsroom in America after a big story. Phil had with him a recently released academic report on the causes of an earlier riot, the Watts riot in Los Angeles. It was a super newsy report because it contradicted the prevailing public views of what had caused the riot. University faculty had polled African Americans in the community and through their voices told the roots of the California riot. When it came his turn in the brainstorming, Phil proposed doing a similar study in Detroit. But it was very different, he said. It would be done by the newspaper, not by academics. The big difference? We were newspaper people, he recalled later, and it would not take us 2 years. An editor asked him, well, how long? He said, give me 3 weeks. The mechanics of how Phil and some academic advisors pulled that survey off is worth studying. It was a huge, huge undertaking. Think of this, it was an in-person survey from homes and neighborhoods at the center of the rioting. The goal was not to just talk to community members, but actually talk to rioters. To hear from those people whose voices were often shortchanged in coverage of racial strife, it was not going to work to send Phil and a bunch of white guy reporters from the newspaper out into the community. They recruited funding and a partner in the Detroit Urban League. They drafted a sampling plan and a questionnaire, and they lined up and trained African American school teachers who were on the summer break to go out and do the interviewing. Within 2 weeks, they had a valid sample of 437 Detroiters from the riot-stricken areas, including 11% who admitted some degree of riot activity. The story was published August 20th. Let's take that in for a minute. That was less than a month after the riots ended. It was big news. Findings contradicted 2 popular theories of riots. That riots were the most desperate residents at the bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum, and that rioting was centered among transplanted Southerners who had adjusted poorly to living in the North. Perhaps most surprising, rioting was not a signal of a breakdown in societal norms. Black citizens in the riot area, including rioters, saw burning and looting as crimes. They didn't see the riots as beneficial or strategic. They said they had gotten caught up in the moment. The lead of Phil's package on the survey. Despite a recent week of rioting, Detroit's Negro community is basically stable and committed to American values. The coverage included a ranking of 23 causes of rioting, with police brutality far and away the reason most cited. Stories explored why some businesses were targeted more than others, and it wasn't always random. It was often the businesses that were perceived to be unfair to African American community members. The paper had a big info box, not a very pretty one, I have to admit, of crosstabs showing the characteristics of rioters, where they were raised, unemployment, feelings about the civil rights movement, and police mistreatment. And it had a nerd box. The nerd box is a precision journalist slang for the methodology statement. And it included these words: the survey procedure was equivalent to that used in the most exacting academic studies. And that brings us to focus a little bit more deeply on the first pioneer we're going to talk about today, our bow-tied guru of precision journalism, Phil Meyer. Phil wasn't always a professor, of course. He had a robust journalistic career 26 years before he joined the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he taught as a Keenan professor and later a night chair. But Phil, trust me, he was born to be an academic. He's got a huge intellect, unlimited curiosity, a passel of books under his belt. In 27 years at UNC, he influenced thousands of students and professionals, including me. He taught polling, civic journalism, communications technology. He once wrote a heartbreaking book that I believe showed that mediocre newspapers make more money than good newspapers, though he didn't put it quite that bluntly. Amid all that, his greatest contribution was defining and spreading a discipline we call precision journalism. Precision journalism advocates the use of social science research techniques and scientific methods in journalistic endeavors. He grew from his year as a Nieman Scholar in 1966 and 67. The Nieman Fellowship since 1938 has offered journalists a mid-career chance to take a break from work, spend 2 semesters at Harvard, auditing the classes of their choice and studying whatever they want. They make their own plan of study, and Phil's plan of study was the emerging field of political polling. By 1969, when Phil started writing the first edition of Precision Journalism, his interest in that narrow field had broadened into social science research methods and how they could be applied to journalism. Now, Phil was not any better at deadline than some of the journalists we know. His book wasn't ultimately published until 1972. It had chapters on statistics, sampling, survey research, field experiments, data structure, and other essentials. It was written in Phil's signature style, which is a folksy, all-shucks Kansas storyteller with the Mensa brain. I'll give an example. I can still hear this in my head from his classes. We would talk about significance tests, and he would explain what a chi-square significance test was. What are the odds of getting results this goofy or goofier, he would say. If it's this goofy or goofier by chance alone, that's what a chi-square test can tell us. His teaching and writing were an enduring hit. Precision Journalism was published in 4 editions and is still used in some classrooms today. And the discipline he promoted, depending on your viewpoint, either founded or shaped the areas of data-driven journalism that are commonly described today. Computer-assisted reporting, called CAR for short, power reporting, computational journalism, data journalism. All of these are broader than precision journalism, which is really about news gathering and not all aspects of producing and publishing the news. But I think practitioners of any of these areas would recognize the best in each is sharing at their heart the kind of analytical discipline that Phil's precision journalism championed. Since Phil wrote the first edition, some of the embrace of social science has ebbed because of the backlash against universal truth. Methods maybe were oversold in the beginning. The vast power of computers has made other valid research methods more possible. But that doesn't negate the lessons of precision journalism. Here's what Phil had to say about that. These methods still beat the educated guesses, the thumb-sucking, the haphazard data collection of the past. Scientific method is still one good way invented by humankind to cope with its prejudices, wishful thinking, and perceptual blinders. It's definitely needed in journalism now more than ever as the craft struggles to maintain its identity against corruption by entertaining and advertising. I would update that statement by adding to it corruption by chasing clickbait, partisan and fake news, the Washington Press Corps' relentless focus on the trivial, and accuracy sacrificed for speed. Today, I'm going to introduce you to some pioneers who took that analytical discipline far beyond Phil's original vision, who launched us, in essence, into this room 5 decades later to talk about computation in journalism. First, I have to give you a few apologies. I'm leaving out a lot of pioneers. I'm really sorry. I'm not saying my list is the only pioneers. They're just my list. I admire them. Their life's work contributed to the important lessons we're going to talk about, and the things they taught us will carry us in the future. They all deserve to be on the list, but it's not to say there aren't others who should be on the list as well. But y'all really don't want me to keep you here all afternoon talking about everybody I know. The second apology, I'm sure you'll notice that the list is largely male and overwhelmingly white. Okay, 100% white. That was the environment when I started in precision journalism, and it didn't change for a long time. I like to joke that the first woman of car dinner at a journalism computing conference was me in my hotel room with room service. It wasn't quite that bad. I probably just didn't know the handful of other women there, but it sure was lonely in those days. It's changed a lot now, and we'll talk about that more later. But for now, let's jump into this fascinating list of all white but still important pioneers. Most of these pioneers I'm going to mention were friends of mine, but I've never met Clarence Jones in person. I still admire him mightily. He was this incredible swashbuckling reporter. He specialized in dirty cops and the mob and crooked politicians for the Miami Herald. He liked digging and he liked going undercover. He was also the kind of reporter who wanted to use in-depth analysis in his stories. He told me he did lots of math, and believe me, math is not a friend in most newsrooms in America. He recalled a time he was doing a story about law statistics, and it was requiring days and days of long division. One of his colleagues in the newsroom told him, "They've got one of those new calculators up in the accounting department. They might loan it to you." So Clarence borrowed a calculator. He described it to me as the kind of thing they would later give away at a bank if you opened a new account. I could work my numbers in a matter of hours before it would have taken me days. That kind of calculating mind is how he came to be a precision journalism pioneer. Clarence had been part of a 4-member reporting team that revealed tremendous corruption in the sheriff's department in Miami, working in 1965 and 66. They eventually got the sheriff and all his top deputies indicted. The scandal was so bad that the voters voted and abolished the office of sheriff. Miami-Dade County is the only county in Florida, even today, with no elected sheriff. He had a theory that if they looked at a bunch of cases, they would find patterns. The same cop, bail bondsman, defense attorney, and judge, all working on the same case where bribes were being paid for reduced sentences or dismissals. He convinced the Herald to spend $10,000 on his hunch, and he hired Miami University law students to help him investigate. They went down to the courthouse and looked up cases, something like 3,000 cases. For each case, they recorded variables on computer cards. They were called mark sense cards because you could sense the mark with a computer. You ticked them off with a lead pencil. Card readers would convert those to computer data for the mainframe computer. The students completed 4 cards per case. Clark Lambert, the Herald's computing guru, said he would write the program that would detect the pattern of corruption. But ultimately, he couldn't. It seems simpler now, but it was really complex at the time. The story was shelved. I guess it didn't kill Clarence's career because he got a promotion to the Washington Bureau and went to work there. And one day he got a call from an editor back in Miami who said, "Oh shit, get your ass back down here." The editors had forgotten that months before they had purchased an advertisement in the editor and publisher trade magazine touting their project and the newfangled manner of investigative reporting. Here's the picture from that ad. "Meet our new reporting team," the ad said, and touted reporter Clarence Jones, a Herald computer. Together, they cracked the information barrier on Dade County's rising crime rate and what happens after an arrest is made. Clarence had to go back to Miami and complete a story to support the ad. The paper hired 2 IBM programmers to write a code that would reveal any patterns. Clarence told me they worked, I don't know, a long time. We only had a window of 15 minutes every afternoon where they could get to the program and see what they would get. They'd call Clarence down to the mainframe computer room and run the program and come up with answers like the average sentence for shoplifting was 25 years. And he'd say, "What? That's not right. Go back to work." They never did find a pattern. Maybe it didn't exist. Ultimately, Clarence wrote a statistical report on the cases. It was published in December of 1968 under the headline, "A Scientific Look at Dade Crime." There was a sidebar about the technique of using the computer under the headline, "A New Concept is Born." The story examined things like how race affects sentence, does a public defender get as good a result as a private attorney, stuff like that. It was pretty innocuous stuff compared to what Clarence had wanted. But as it turns out, it was the first time a reporter had used a computer to crunch public records. Clarence went on to make the switch to TV and continued to be the swashbuckling reporter he was. At WHAS in Louisville, where he was hired because he knew how to investigate police, he went undercover for 8 months to uncover law enforcement corruption. He went into bookie joints every day with a hidden camera. Over the course of his career, his life was in danger so often that he ended up carrying a pistol on assignments. Clarence went on to win 3 DuPont Awards, the TV equivalent of Pulitzer Prizes. He's retired now, but I don't get the impression that Clarence relaxes a lot. He's working on an investigative book. Now, some of y'all have probably heard of these guys, Don Barlett and Jim Steele. In 1972, one of their earliest collaborations was for the Philadelphia Inquirer. The celebrated pair pioneered the use of computers for data analysis on violent crime. Now, didn't I just tell y'all that Clarence did that? He did, but for some reason he was really overlooked, and it was Barlett and Steele who really drew attention to this first case. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on their work because honestly it was really guided by Phil. Not to say they didn't do an important part of it, they certainly did, but Phil was really at the heart of it with them. And their incredible career ended up being celebrated more for their deep focus on documents than for computer analysis. But they're worth mentioning because of the amount of attention that their stories brought to precision journalism. They went through paper records of years of violent crime, complaints to police, warrants, arrest sheets, bail applications, indictments, and probation reports. They culled more than 1,000 completed cases of murder, rape, robbery, and assault, and methodically recorded 42 pieces of information about each case coded onto computer cards. Variables like race, record of the accused, length of service, sentence. The stories that resulted were about unequal justice, and they were held journalistically. Phil had negotiated with Don Barlett and Jim Steele that he would teach them to use the mainframe to do crosstabs, and if they would learn it well enough to do their own computer project next time, he would help them with this one. But the mainframe proved too complicated, and they didn't really embrace computing analysis until PCs were common in newsrooms. Okay, how many of you have ever listened to the podcast Crime Town? Nobody? Okay, a couple of you, good. It's really great. It takes a deep look at one crime city a season and the criminal roots in that city. The first season was Providence, Rhode Island. This guy is not a journalism pioneer. This guy is two-time Mayor Buddy Cianci. He was the star of the show. He was called the P.T. Barnum of Providence. He served 6 terms as mayor during 2 separate stints, both of which ended prematurely when he was convicted of crimes. He ran again in 2014 and lost after serving as mayor 21 years, longer than anyone else who had ever preceded him. He was wildly popular. He also sold his own brand of pasta sauce. Elliot Jaspin was a reporter in Providence when Cianci was arrested and charged with assault of his wife's alleged lover. He was accused of burning the man's eyelids with a cigarette and launching an ashtray at him and a fireplace log. Crime reports say he held the man hostage for 3 hours while a police officer and a former judge watched. Elliot recently recalled in an interview with me, "I think this guy had sexual relations with his wife or his girlfriend. It's vague in my mind. But anyhow, he beat up a guy with a fireplace log, and that's really, for me, the start of computer-assisted reporting." What happened was that all of a sudden, all these agencies piled into Providence and started investigating the Cianci administration. The newspaper's editors thought they would be prudent to do their own investigation. So here's Elliot again. "I was called downtown, and we had a team, and we go out to look at city records and find out what's going on in the city. And you find a slip of paper in there saying these records were taken by the grand jury or the state police or the FBI or whoever. So we're sitting there without any way to investigate the city because we don't have any records. And so I said, what if we got the computer records for the city? Wouldn't that give us the same thing?" This was a pretty newfangled concept. Elliot had done some small programming himself. They did get the computer records on 9-track tape, downloaded them to the city's mainframe, and dug in. It didn't give them exactly the same thing, but it gave them enough to write a few stories about corruption. Elliot had the bug, and he went on to do many more computer-assisted stories, including one that got a ton of admiration in the journalism world. There have been some terrible deaths of school children on school buses that had had accidents. So Elliot obtained and crossed the records of 1,300 school bus drivers with a computerized database of driving records. He found that 25% of the bus drivers had at least one traffic violation, and some were very serious, like drugs, alcohol, invalid licenses, serious accidents. He also checked the criminal records of the bus drivers and found troubling arrests. As a result of this investigation, licensing was reformed and 65 drivers had their bus licenses revoked. And Elliott was on his way with precision journalism, doing many more stories with his new specialty. The thing was, though, all of this work was done on a mainframe computer. Elliott recalled speaking to other journalists about the work. So I'd sit there and I'd explain how this worked, and people would ask questions and they'd say, exactly how did you do it? And so I'd say, well, first you have to get a hold of your company's mainframe. And you could just feel the gloom in the room because working on a mainframe was not exactly child's play. Elliott mulled this problem for a while and concluded if the work could be done on PCs, which were beginning to be adopted in newsrooms around the country, it'd be a whole lot easier. The problem was those 9-track tapes that stored mainframe data. So he wondered if he could figure out a way to read the 9-track tapes into a PC. He proposed a project to the Gannett Center for Media Studies at Columbia University, devising such a system. And they loved the idea after they hired a few folks to explain it to them. He got the idea. He got a fellowship. He was joined by a brilliant grad student named Dan Woods, who had a computer science background, and they went to work. Together in 1989, they developed 9-Track Express. The package of a tape drive, a PC, and software for it was world-changing. It sold for $9,000 to $12,000. It could not only transport the data from the 9-track tape to the PC, it could do it selectively. This was really important because the PCs were not big enough to hold the whole data set that was stored on the 9-track tape. So if you had a huge data set and you only wanted one county of records, you could actually use the software to only download the one county of records. It also packed unpacked records, which was a thing that at the time only mainframes could do. I don't even know if people pack records anymore. At any rate, it was a big, huge breakthrough. But once they had created it, they had to have somebody to teach journalists how to use it. So the Missouri Institute of Computer-Assisted Reporting was created at the University of Missouri. They hired Elliott, actually he proposed it, I think, and he helped launch the institute to begin holding workshops for professional journalists. This is Brant Houston. He was a reporter at the Hartford Courant when Elliott was in Providence. He had heard of Fillmyer, but what really got him excited about the computer-assisted reporting movement was when Time magazine came out with an article about Elliott. He went over to Providence to visit, and Brant was impressed. Elliott, he said, had his own office, full of software on the shelves, and Brant thought he would like to have an office too. He talked to Elliott about the projects he had done, and what Brant was most impressed by was Elliott's vision of spreading computer-assisted reporting throughout the newsroom. At the time, CAR was really limited to investigative reporters. Brant seized quickly on the idea of having a library of critical data for newsrooms to use, and every reporter could use analysis for their beat. So Brant went back to Hartford, got a 286, and went to work teaching himself. Fast forward to 1993, Elliott had built the fledgling MyCar as a modest enterprise. Car training was taking off. There had been a couple of conferences at Indiana University held by Jim Brown. And in Missouri, Elliott's MyCar was across the hall from Investigative Reporters and Editors, a professional association for journalists. IRE folks had noticed how many of their members were gravitating to computer-assisted reporting. And so when Elliott decided to move back to the East Coast, IRE was a natural to continue the program. They obtained a grant from the Freedom Forum to support the endeavor, and in October hired its founding director, Brant Houston. Months later, they changed the name and swapped the word national for Missouri. The National Institute of Computer-Assisted Reporting was on the move. Brant went on to serve 14 years as director of NICAR and ultimately both NICAR and IRE. The small band of journalists doing CAR at the time grew into a movement. NICAR conferences now routinely attract 1,000 people. His leadership spread Carr from a practice exclusively available to in-depth investigators across beats in the newsroom. While Brant was working in Hartford, there was another reporter down south wrestling with computers too. Bill Dedman knew absolutely nothing about computing, nothing. But he was laser focused on a story about mortgage discrimination, called redlining, and he became convinced that the computer was the only way to get it, which led to a winter weekend when his paper, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, had obtained data about Atlanta banks' mortgage lending patterns. They brought in 2 academic consultants from the University of Minnesota to guide the analysis. They planned to work on polling director Dwight Morris's PC over the weekend because Dwight was out of town and it was the only PC available in the newsroom. The data had come in fixed width, and the spreadsheet software on Dwight's desk did not know how to import fixed width data. Bill and the consultants somehow figured out they needed to convert the data into tab delimited files. I'll let Bill take the story from here. How to get those tabs in there? So we found that the accounting department had 15 computers that had WordPerfect, a word processing program. So we broke the file up into 15 files, and we wrote a macro in WordPerfect. Go over 1 space, put in a tab. Go over 3 spaces, put in a tab. Go over 6 spaces, put in a tab. Now you're at the end of the row, go to the next line, go over 1 space, 3 spaces, 6 spaces. So when we ran the macro, I walked around, and at the end of every row, or at the end of every page, or whatever it was, I had to hit enter, or whatever key it was, to make the macro move on. And so I was just walking around the computer, from computer to computer in the accounting department, occasionally pressing keys to make the macro keep going to split up this file. In addition to getting the files in a spreadsheet that weekend, Bill and the consultants wrote out a plan for the redlining study. What they did not do is complete any analysis. Mostly, Bill said, what happened was we ran this macro all weekend long, and on Monday morning the editors came in and they said, "What did you find out?" And I said, "Well, we put some spaces in the numbers." The numbers ultimately did prove to be hugely revealing, and in May of 1988, the Atlanta newspaper launched a series on redlining. It rocked the city. It showed that white neighborhoods received 5 times as many bank loans as black neighborhoods of comparable income and creditworthiness. One story featured the chair of the county commission, a prominent and wealthy black man who had been rejected repeatedly for a home improvement loan. The reaction to the stories was huge. Activists picketed the banks scrambled to explain the pattern revealed in the series, and ultimately they offered additional funding for loans to minority lenders. And in 1989, Bill won a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. To say it changed everything would be an understatement. Suddenly, every newsroom in America was on notice that this snazzy new tool of computer-assisted reporting was not a novelty. It could propel you in the highest heights of journalism, the esteem and endorsement of a Pulitzer Prize. Steve Doig has done so much more than maps in his incredible career, but I chose the title because of his groundbreaking work at the Miami Herald after Hurricane Andrew struck the city in August of 1992. When Steve was in college at Dartmouth, he took a math class from John Kemeny, one of the 2 authors of the basic computer programming language. Steve wasn't very taken by calculus, but he was taken by the idea of using computer code to streamline his work. It was another 15 years before Steve would use BASIC again. He was a reporter at the Miami Herald State Capitol Bureau, and he got an Atari 800 for home use. He quickly realized computing would be a powerful tool at work, and so he convinced his bosses to buy him an IBM PC for the office. He recalls he spent a week writing and debugging a program to make crosstabs on legislative roll call votes, something off-the-shelf software handles instantly. Steve at some point took an all-day training class from Phil Meyer, and he decided he too wanted to be a precision journalist. So Steve taught himself the tools of social science from statistics to demographics to cartography. A high point was his analysis of the 1990 census. In 1991, a month after the data was released, he and another Knight Ridder journalist published a project about changes in segregation in America using the Dissimilarity Index. When a colleague called William Fry, a leading demographer, and asked for a comment on the analysis, Fry was stunned. "My God," he said, "I had no idea newspapers could do that kind of work." He explained it would be months or years before he could get funding and produce such an analysis. Steve described precision journalism as social science on deadline. Now I have to take a minute and give Steve his due. When I asked him about the highlights along his precision journalism path, he said one of them was beating me and Phil on this story. I was working at USA Today and Phil was a consultant on our census coverage. It was not a highlight of my career. After all his self-training in social science, Steve was uniquely positioned for one of Miami's biggest stories ever. In August of 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore across Miami with wind speeds exceeding 150 miles an hour. Andrew destroyed or heavily damaged more than 80,000 homes, including Steve's. The paper covered the disaster and the recovery, and they put together an investigative team to dig into why the damage was so bad. They had built a database of homes that were damaged, and Steve realized he could merge that with the property tax rolls, which would allow him to look for patterns in the homes that were damaged. He told me, "When I ran the numbers, I found the first smoking gun of my career. There was no pattern to be seen when I compared storm damage to such variables as home value, type of construction, location, or distance from the shore. But there was a strong counterintuitive pattern connected to the year of construction. The newer the home, the more likely to be destroyed." A 16-page special section published on December 20th revealed what had gone wrong. Declining standards of construction, shoddy inspections, weakened building homes urged by campaign-contributing construction companies. The maps of the damage, overlaid with information about the age of subdivisions, largely told the story. The package was published 3 months after the storm, and it ultimately won a Pulitzer Prize for Public Service the following year. Social science on deadline, indeed. Steve left the Herald after 19 years to teach at the Cronkite School at Arizona State University. In advance of the 2000 census, he and Paul Overberg taught hundreds of journalists in 7 workshops around the country how to interpret demographic data. He hosted a regular boot camp for reporters who were ready to move beyond spreadsheets to learn tools like correlation, regression, sampling, hypothesis testing, and probability. By 2005, those tools had become so common in journalism that Steve worked with IRA to create an award honoring the best investigative journalism done using social science research techniques. It's named in honor of Phil Meyer. I'm mighty proud to say that the AJC won it this year with our Doctors in Sex Abuse project. Okay, Pat Stith is the most competitive reporter I have ever met. He loves to win. Here's what he has to say about learning to analyze data for a story. "I knew I was going to learn this because anybody who learned it could beat somebody who didn't learn it like a tub, and I'm interested in winning." So now imagine Pat at his first IRA conference. It was here in Chicago in 1985. If you've never been to an IRA conference, it's like this on steroids. A bunch of reporters who sit on panels and share their best journalism skills. They tell a few war stories, and sometimes those war stories continue and overlap late into the bar, but the point is, it's all about folks teaching others what they know. It was astounding to Pat, who I said is highly competitive. He was born in Alabama, grew up in North Carolina, and worked a lot of his youth in his dad's coat hanger factory. It was sweaty, dirty work, and he was thrilled when he got out and got a $1 an hour job as a sports writer for the Charlotte News. He did a stint in the Navy, went to UNC, and began building a celebrated career as a journalist. Pat worked hard. He wanted to beat everyone. He told me that weekend in Chicago, the only people he would talk to were waiters and waitresses when he would order food. "I'd just go to all these meetings and sit there," Pat said. I was astonished that they were telling how they did stuff, and I was thinking to myself, you're an idiot, and if you think I'm going to tell you the 2 or 3 things that I know, you better think again. Of course, Pat went on to become one of the more generous of sharers, a pioneer old dog who learned new tricks and loved to tell everyone how they could learn too. He served on the board of investigative reporters and editors and helped found NICAR. What made him such a great advocate for computer-assisted reporting was his storytelling. People love to hear Pat talk about Carr because he's so colorful. He says my accent is thicker than his, but I'm not sure I agree. I know his stories are better than mine. Now, Pat's the kind of journalist, like many of us, who would do the counting and sorting and analysis of Carr before Carr was a thing. He said he did stories where he literally hand-copied elements or lines out of thousands of records and then used various color-coded pencils to categorize them. And that what changed everything for Pat was 9-Track Express. There was a young editor at the Raleigh News and Observer, an early adopter of computing, and he sent Pat to an early computer-assisted reporting conference in Indiana. Pat went and he heard Elliot Jaspin and his co-developer of 9-Track Express, Dan Woods, talk about downloading mainframe data on a PC. He was astonished, and he saw it would give him a huge edge in his role as an investigative reporter covering bureaucrats in the North Carolina state capitol. I love the idea, he said, because I knew, why would you deal with a few dozen records or a few hundred or even a few thousand records when you can get the whole database? And then take it apart, put it back together again, and go ask them questions about their job. In many cases, you're telling them about their own work. You just overwhelm them. Pat said he was never a nerd, a phrase he uses admiringly. He just wasn't wired that way. He took one of Elliot's classes in Missouri, but he said he didn't learn that much because he's not technically oriented, and SQL was really hard for him. So ultimately, he and his paper recruited Dan Woods, Elliot's grad student assistant, and another pioneer, to go to Raleigh and work with the News and Observer. My objective was never to become the best nerd in the country, Pat said. My hat's off to those who do have that ambition, but my ambition was to put stories in the paper. In the early days, Pat and others in the Carr community spent so much of our time educating bureaucrats about the idea of giving government data to newspapers. Pat and Dan would visit an office, and some official would tell them there's no way the government could get them the data out of the computers. It would take tons of programming and it would cost a fortune. And Dan, who was a computer scientist, would say something like, I can do it in about 10 minutes. Let me sit down at your computer. And they would say, oh no, you can't do that. So he'd interview them a little more and go back to the office and write up the queries and send it to them. Pat went on to win a Pulitzer in 1996 about the politics behind the North Carolina hog industry and environmental damage it caused. I think Dan was gone from the paper by then, but the stories relied heavily on analysis of government data. It was a great work of journalism, and Pat had a huge, impactful career you can read about in Jay Hamilton's great book about investigative reporting, Democracy's Detectives. But in my mind, Pat's greatest journalistic feat was dispelling the fear of using computers in our work. He was middle-aged when he got into it, older than most, and he was absolutely unafraid to admit how hard it was for him. But it was totally worth the hard, he said. In the early days, it was a great temptation to just get a database and run out stories, the top 10, the bottom 10, the most, the least, to dazzle readers, or more likely colleagues, with the novelty of a computer-aided story. Pat was persistent in asserting that this was not the reason to get into Carr. It is a tool, he said, to address problems in the community, to shed light on the causes and possibly find some solutions. I told him I was coming here this weekend and about some of the things on the schedule and some of the things happening in journalism today. And here's what he said, and you'll recognize Pat's voice by now. You know what? It's sort of like if you go back to Orville and Wilbur Wright. When I was in that business, we were flying bi-wing planes, and we thought we were something because we were going 200 miles an hour. And now you people, Pat says, have been to the moon and are planning manned missions to Mars, and it's a different world. Unlike Barlett and Steele, I don't believe Jennifer and Sarah ever worked side by side, but working separately in similar roles, they influenced thousands of journalists, and that's before they went on to hugely successful newsroom careers of their own. They did so much groundbreaking journalism. Both of them had a leg up that gave them an undergrad training in computer science and economics that gave them a leg up in precision journalism. And both of them joined IRE as trainers in the early, heady days of NICAR when the demand for computer skills exploded and training workshops across the country became an essential part of IRE's mission. Jennifer was a pollster and a data researcher at the San Jose Mercury News in the early 90s. She got her graduate degree in journalism at Missouri while Elliot Jasmine was there. One day in San Jose, she got a call to speak at an IRE conference in Raleigh. Pat was organizing. He told me he was desperate for women speakers. It was completely new to Jennifer. It was the first time she had spoken to the group, and she was a huge hit. I remember a spreadsheet class. I'm pretty sure we were teaching it together, and you know how the spreadsheet works with sort. You get everything organized, and you do everything you need to, and then you hit the button, and magically the data instantly makes sense. We had a reporter in the room who burst into tears. She was so astounded by this development. It was a great conference. The people were laying in the halls practically to get into the panel rooms, and the bar had to kick us out every night. Board members also immediately began recruiting Jennifer to be the first training director of IRE. She served that role in 94 and 95. She's like Pat, a huge force of enthusiasm and cheerleading for precision journalism. And she trained some 4,000 journalists across North America and even in Bulgaria and Finland. Sarah was IRE's third training director. She's completely unusual for our field. She worked as an economist for a decade before starting in journalism. So the tools of analysis, if not social science, were common to her. She told me when she got into reporting, the lack of analytical knowledge really threw her. One thing that always surprised me was getting into an industry that its entire value was the ability to compile and sort through facts and information, and it was not using any tool that the rest of the world was using to compile and sort through facts at the time. Sarah's a real lifelong scholar and one of the most thoughtful pioneers about the strengths and needs of our discipline. She served as the Knight Professor of Practice at Duke University and was an Innovation Fellow at the Tau Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia. And even though she's kept a foot in academia her whole career, she's also had a major force on investigations at the Washington Post and the New York Times. While she's a sophisticated data scientist, she's also one of the most persistent and prominent advocates for keeping our eye on other journalistic traditions. I've come to believe that we shouldn't be baby social scientists, she said. We should be journalists, and that we can adopt methods from other fields without having to embrace everything about those fields. We're still doing stories, not studies. Jennifer and Sarah are part of a proud circle of CAR trainers. I wish I could take time to tell you about all of them, but I have to limit my list. So that's our pioneers. I wanted to use some of their thoughts and insights to reflect on a few of the strengths of the last 5 decades, the things that have built our discipline into the force it is in the journalism industry today. My hope is that embracing those strengths can carry us forward 50 more years. Mashups. Boy, that sounds like such a 2007 word, doesn't it? From Phil's first idea of adopting social science research techniques, precision journalism has thrived by co-opting the tools and techniques used in other professions. The digital revolution has accelerated that. I use the phrase mashup broadly to mean the adaptation that has so defined CAR, mashups of professions like journalism and social science, but also mashups like professionals and academics that made Phil's Detroit riot coverage and Bill Dedman's Color of Money such groundbreaking work. Mashups like Elliot Jasmine's decision to mix school bus data and driver record data in ways that was never meant to be mixed. Being unafraid to find the best outside our profession, whether it's data or tools or skill sets, and mix it with our profession, is the courage to innovate that will keep us vibrant and relevant. Community. Journalists aren't typically joiners, and we fiercely resist any kind of licensing or official standards imposed on our practice. That's because we believe the First Amendment's for everyone. But I would argue that NICAR and IRE have done more to advance professionalism of our craft than any licensing board or association. The community of NICAR and C+J and other groups that gather around this discipline aren't exclusive. You don't have to apply for membership or prove your worth. Some have wondered if NICAR is too inclusive and if the big embrace of web developers and visualizers has strayed too far from the underlying reporting tradition. I would say no. Our community is growing and robust and finally somewhat diverse, although we still do not have significant representation among African Americans. But I believe every member of this community brings value and knowledge. Storytelling, what sets us apart from other analytical professions and even the social scientists we love to emulate. Journalists exist to illuminate the human condition. No study or scientific research alone can do that. It requires the texture of humans that comes from interviewing and observation and skilled writing. Our ability to tell the story of wind speed damage in Hurricane Andrew, or children mistreated by a system that's supposed to protect them, or black citizens of Atlanta unfairly discriminated against. Those stories are what animate our work and cause readers to clamor for reform. We can't get along without great storytelling. Now, if you've been waiting the whole speech to find out about why Playboy is in the title, it fits into this bit about storytelling. Phil Meyer was a bow tie wearing, theory quoting intellectual scholar, but the father of precision journalism is also a great storyteller. And at the time he was learning his craft in Neiman, Playboy and other magazines like that hired what they considered the best writers in the country. Phil, like many Neiman scholars, had a hope of writing his way out of the newspaper business. And so while he was at Harvard, he looked for ideas that he could sell to a slick magazine. He settled on game theory, which fascinated him, and studied up on it. And he later turned his lessons into an article for Playboy with everyday examples of game theory at work. His twist was to use game theory to build strategies for chasing women and getting dates. Now, why is that included in this talk on precision journalism? Well, he reused the chapter in his book, and so I figured I could use it as a hook to keep you listening. The spirit of sharing. It's never been totally clear to me why, but Carl was open source before open source was cool. It was probably because the whole idea behind IRE was to share knowledge in a specific discipline. And as you recall from Pat Stith, it seemed quite unusual for journalism. I remember attending the first computer-assisted reporting conference in Indiana. I came home with a thick stack of handouts that represented the competitive advantage of every speaker who had given their secrets away. The next year, I made sure I took a stack of handouts. I had written to clean up text data in the Paradox software. I fit in instantly and was warmly welcomed by the CAR community and became seen as some kind of expert on Paradox. Remember that extremely competitive Pat Stith? As you probably recall, even he converted. Why? Here's what he had to say. After a year or two, I realized there are so few of us and so many of them, the bad guys, that we need to work together and share. We continue this tradition in today's session. Transparency and replication. From the beginning, there's been a huge tradition of transparency. In fact, precision journalism has always been far more transparent than traditional journalism. The idea stems from the notion that scientific method insists on replication, external review, and data sharing. You can't have any of that without transparency. The so-called nerd box began with the earliest of precision journalism. Both Phil Meyer and Clarence Jones' reports had significant explanatory articles accompanying the work. Publishing methodology and data is so widely accepted in the community of CAR now, I don't know any significant debate against it. Roots in investigative journalism. One of the things I think has served us best over the years. Investigative reporters are the ones who gravitated to this because they love records and they love digging out the truth. Precision journalism was a new way of using records to dig out the truth. Some of us thought all journalists would gravitate toward this, but it just hadn't been the case. Pat pointed out to me recently that the only newsroom folks who really took to it early on were the ones who love records. In fact, there's really not enough widespread basic analytical skill in newsrooms across the country even yet. Every pioneer I interviewed spoke about that. So journalism leaders who are present, take note of that. Nonetheless, investigative reporting units around the country are closely aligned with data journalists, as is my data journalism team in Atlanta. Investigative journalists are often the most skilled researchers and critical and skeptical thinkers in newsrooms. And I would argue, of course I'm arguing from the perspective of an investigative journalism leader, that investigative journalism is most closely aligned with Phil's original vision. Investigative journalism has to be authoritative, because it has to be right. To do that, you have to create a hypothesis and examine all around it, attempt to prove it, but also attempt to disprove it and investigate how it can be disproved. And you don't just write it up. You have to confront the bad actors with your evidence before it's published and let them try to shoot you down. Just as precision journalism has made investigators stronger, I believe the discipline of investigative reporting has made computer-assisted journalism stronger. I hope everyone here takes time to understand and respect the difficult and different craft of investigative reporters and how they improve our craft. Finally, what made us strong and carried us for 5 decades was pioneers, the people I introduced and others who picked up the discipline, taught themselves, risked going outside the lines, then taught others what they had learned. There were so many more than I could possibly mention. Their influence is unimaginable. One of my favorite things Phil has said about the pioneers is that they were all after a higher standard of truth-telling. That's what we're talking about here this weekend. And we have in this room some new pioneers doing work that the folks I introduced you to could not even imagine. So to all you pioneers out there, we're counting on you to keep the discipline strong for another 5 decades. Thanks.
We have time for a couple of questions, if anybody would have any for Shawn. Yeah, here we go.
Okay.
That was great, thanks. To a history of which I'm almost completely unaware. So
Good.
the only name I recognized was Phil Meyer and Rich Gordon. So I appreciated that a lot. So social science itself is now changing, I think, under the, with the availability of data online and in a very substantial ways and pretty quickly. I wonder what you think what you think the chances of sort of quick uptake of these new approaches in journalism as well?
I think we've seen and continue to see a tremendous explosion in new ways of getting at the truth, new ways of testing the truth. All the things we're talking about here, and if you ever go to a NICAR conference, it's sort of unbelievable all the new ways that are developing to not just tell stories, but to test the truth of stories. So I think the uptick the last 5 years has, I would say, exceeded by 10 times the first 45 years. It's really unbelievable how fast the discipline is changing. There's a little bit of danger in that. The computer allows you to do a lot of things without even understanding them. And I think that we've seen some issues with that, but I still feel like overall it's pretty mind-boggling what you can do. I was blown away, I don't know if y'all saw it last week, by something we could never do without digitization of journalism, which was the New York Times taking the gunshots in Las Vegas and very quickly showing just through the cadence of the gunshots that the guns had to be modified. They put the sound and the sound pattern of a semi-automatic weapon next to an automatic weapon next to the sound of the weapon that was used in Las Vegas, and it was totally clear that this was not a semi-automatic weapon. That kind of innovation is happening every day.
We have time for one more question, if there is one.
Did that happen?
Yeah. Give this to Jay.
Thanks. A key theme that you talked about was how mainframes and PCs were first in the business office of newspapers and eventually got used in story discovery process. And your team was one of the first to use machine learning in story discovery. And I wondered if you could tell folks how you chose to do that and how you got the resources to do it.
Sure. I'll go real quickly on this, and I talked about this a little last year, but my team in Atlanta was looking at doctors who abuse patients and how widespread it was. And to make a very, very, very 18-month long story very short, we obtained 100,000 records from across the country relating to doctors' transgressions in their profession, all kinds of transgressions, not just sex abuse. And we needed to sort out the ones that were sex abuse. I started reading the cases, and I went into work on Monday after a weekend of reading cases, and I was just crying because it was going to take us 7 years to do the project. And one of our really brilliant data journalists, Jeff Ernshausen, used machine learning to essentially teach the computer to read the cases for us and tell us that these are sex abuse cases and these are not. I will not claim that was the first use of machine learning in journalism, but a lot of people say it was a pretty groundbreaking use. We won the Meyer Award for it, and it's being used a lot more now in daily journalism. A lot of organizations have adopted those techniques. So, you know, we did that because we have a data team and we have dedicated resources for that. It didn't require what the early days did, where you had to sneak into the accounting department after dark and use their computer or anything like that. The biggest resource for us on that was time, and I think that's an issue that plagues a lot of newsrooms in America today because of the shortage of staff. We have the luxury of being able to commit quite a bit of time. I think it took us about 2 months to test and develop the machine learning and train the machine learning up, but it wasn't like expensive. It was just a matter of journalism time.
Shawn, thank you very much.
Thank you.